Well, howdy there, folks. James Political Friar coming at you again. I got the White Sox hat on, so we're going to do one of those rarest of rares. It's a history talk. I did one for Thanksgiving, and Christmas was just 2 days back, and I thought I'd do a little history talk about Christmas, in particular that famous painting of George Washington standing in the front of a boat, somehow not falling into the Delaware River as he leads an attack on the Hessians in Trenton. And that is a image that Americans will recognize, and they have some sense of what actually happened. And this video is going to tell you what actually happened there, and how genuinely critical for our country's history that moment was. That Christmas Day really did matter, as much as the mythology says, and maybe more. So here's the story. The Revolutionary War got going in 1775, Battle of Lexington and Concord, and eventually Bunker Hill, where the British had mixed results, attacking south of Boston to defeat the Patriot Army, but lose a lot of British soldiers in the meantime, which led to Washington being appointed as the commander of the Continental Army and his successful siege of Boston. So the British garrison in North America was initially concentrated in Boston, Massachusetts, because that's where all the revolutionary hotheads were. And it turns out that once Washington captured some guns from a fort in New York called Ticonderoga and put Boston under siege, the British, they retreated. They got in their boats and they left. And the North American continent was not free of British army, but pretty free of the British army for about 6 months. Now, the British weren't going to let that stand. I mean, of course not. So they planned a campaign to strike at the most important economic center on the continent, and that's New York City. General Howe was appointed by Parliament to lead a campaign to take New York City as the primary base out of which the British Army would operate and put down this silly little rebellion that the American colonists have selfishly started. And he gathered a truly immense flotilla of British ships and soldiers to attack New York City. He sailed this armada across the Atlantic Ocean, and in April of 1776, he landed on Staten Island unopposed. Now, Washington wasn't ignorant of the British plans. He had deployed what Continental Army he had to New York, concentrating them on the southern tip of Long Island and Manhattan, primarily hoping to control the narrows of the East River and the Hudson River to prevent the British Navy from getting north up the Hudson River or between Long Island and Manhattan and landing north of Manhattan in what's now the Bronx. Well, the British obliged. They went from Staten Island and then they landed on the southern tip of Long Island and confronted George's army. And, and the Americans immediately ran away. They ran away. They hardly fought. They just ran away. And George Washington threw his hat down and jumped up and down on it and declaimed that these soldiers were impossible as he orchestrated a retreat over the East River into Manhattan, where the British obligingly landed again and the Americans again ran away. They ran all the way north to what they, at that point, had called Fort Washington, again in the Bronx. And they hunkered down to wait for the British to follow them north into the northern part of Manhattan Island. And when the British confronted the Americans on the northern part of Manhattan Island, the Americans ran away. They ran away. They barely fought. They quite pathetically ran. And George Washington couldn't get anything done. They ended up running all the way up the Hudson River until they crossed over into New Jersey, with the British not even really chasing them at that point. But after they crossed the Hudson River into New Jersey, Washington directed the Continental Army south, down the coast to around the Philadelphia area, where that capital city was, potentially the next target. Actually, not potentially, definitely the next target. And through the summer of 1776, the Continental Army and the British Army skirmished. But every time the British Army brought the Continental Army to an actual battle, they ran away. The American army was simply incapable of standing and fighting the British. Its morale, its training, its doctrine, its cohesion was simply insufficient. And it turns out free men under the American flag really don't like dying for their country. And so they didn't. They ran away. And come the winter of 1776-77, the British had established outposts all the way up and down the coast from New York City into New Brunswick and then south all the way through the New Jersey countryside and along the Delaware River. The Americans had been shoved into Pennsylvania, and they were along the west bank of the Delaware River by the end of the year, with the British having had a remarkably successful campaign. Uh, Winter in the 18th century was not a time for fighting. You just didn't do it. And so General Howe, standing on his great victories, set up a series of defensive outposts. Southernmost one was in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and there was one in Trenton, New Jersey, and then running north all the way to New York City proper. George Washington was having a political problem. See, he had lost every battle for a year. He couldn't get funding. He couldn't get people to reenlist. See, the Americans had effectively a militia where everyone signed up for a single year, 1 year of service, and when that year was up, you could go home. And boy, how many of these American soldiers want to be in an army with losers, people who run, people who don't fight? And the morale, as you can imagine, was not just bad, but maybe even lose the war bad. Washington needed a solution to his political problem. And the solution to his political problem is what you seek in war, and that's victory. Any victory, even a little victory would do. And so Washington prepared to have winter quarters in Pennsylvania and to lick his wounds and try to get more support. But before he did that, he was going to find a way to put a little blood on the British nose. And he knew from his intelligence, his actually fairly well developed network of spies in New York, that the Hessians, that's a German garrison, these Germans were allied with the British. Actually, they were strictly speaking the subjects of the British king. The British king ruled technically Hesse, a small German state province in northwestern Germany, and so these Hessians had been recruited from that area to come and fight for the British Empire. It wasn't weird; these guys did that a lot. The Hessians were not the evil kind of mercenaries coming to take coin to drink patriot blood that some of the propaganda at the time suggested. These were just soldiers who were bound to the British king through a personal loyalty. That he was their liege, he was their king too, and so the Hessians were encamped in Trenton under Howe's orders. They were one of the outposts, but it's snowing and there's ice and it's Christmas. There's no way that there's going to be any trouble. And Washington had that intelligence, and he decided to make trouble. He gathered local fishing boats, local barges, really anything that'll float, and he made 3 landings across the Delaware River on Christmas Eve and caught the Hessians without any guards. And in a blitz that actually was largely bloodless, the Americans defeated and captured the entire Hessian outpost. And all of those soldiers surrendered. They basically got out of bed, saw an American with a musket, and surrendered. And it ended up being a incredibly one-sided victory and broke General Howe's line of fortifications in New Jersey because the Americans controlled Trenton at this point. And so the Hessians all captured. They became prisoners of war and were taken off the battlefield. And General Howe had to retreat. He was outmaneuvered. He was outflanked. His outposts south of Trenton were untenable once the American army was astride the river there. And so he ended up retreating all the way back to southern New York City. And so the campaign of 1776, which had been incredibly one sided, ended up at the end of the year looking a little different. It looked like General Howe just captured New York. He was no longer in New Jersey. He was no longer threatening Philadelphia. That was a big deal that winter. That convinced thousands more of the Patriots soldiers to reenlist, sign up for another year, and got the Congress in Philadelphia to provide more funds. Washington solved his political problem in a morning by doing the absolutely unexpected and winning. It's a heck of a story. And without that moral victory, because it wasn't that decisive militarily. You're talking about 2,000 Hessians who were captured. It was not a small number, especially for an 18th century army, but not crushing by any stretch of the imagination. Uh, you're talking about a moral victory that ended up becoming a major strategic strike for Washington, a major success because it kept him going. And the thing about the American Revolution is, as long as the Americans weren't losing, they were winning. The only question was whether the American will to resist would outlast the British willingness to continue to take casualties. And it was a good question. There were enough Americans who would have been fine with giving up. And the British were going to spend quite a bit of blood and treasure waiting for the Americans to give up. But the British could never have conquered the Americans. It was only the Americans who could have defeated themselves, as is the case with so many American wars. America doesn't get defeated, at least it hasn't historically. America gives up. And with this attack on Trenton on Christmas, Washington ensured that America wasn't going to give up that year. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that little chat. It's one of the lesser known, even though totally famous stories in American history. And let me know if you want any more of these history talks. I enjoy putting them together. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.